You are aware, of course, that through part of July and August, we have concerned ourselves with what we call Gnostic mythic reality. And in that respect, a little bit of recollection of our principles may be useful, and I hope not a very lengthy one, namely that there are certain regions of consciousness in our psyches and in the psyche of the universe which are not accessible to most other forms of cognition, of understanding, with the exception of myth. And that this has, of course, been practically manifest in many parts of the world, practically everywhere, in the sense that when certain profound, insight-producing, and I don't like the word transformative, it has been overused, but let's say even transformative experiences are had by humans, and if these in some way need to be at least attempted to be passed on, that this would be done in the form of a myth or a story. In fact, there are many places in the world, I have been in some of them to this day, which is a little bit related to that, wherein often when you ask what appears to be an important, profound question to somebody, they will look at you and say, well, in order to answer that, let me tell you a story. And then they will tell you a story. And if you have enough sense to discern from the story as to what the message is, then you have done well. So this has really been a universal custom regarding certain subjects, obviously not everything. However, the orientation of the mental, the thinking aspects of cultures varies and changes, and as, for instance, our culture has moved first gradually, and now it would seem, unfortunately, all too rapidly, into a secular and rationalistic and even materialistic orientation, then the myth seems to lose its good report, as Old English has it. You know, if you're a person of good report, let us say in Shakespeare's time, that means that you're a real good guy or gal. You know, you have people talk well of you. So myth is no longer in the regard that it had for such a very, very long time. In our culture, probably, certainly beginning with the Mediterranean cultures of the Egyptians, of the Persians, of the Greeks, and ultimately the Romans. I like to recall, and probably have recalled to the hearing of some of you, for which I apologize, the incident that the great Joseph Campbell told us once in one of his talks. He fairly early in his career, he was invited to at that time, I think, not television yet, but a radio show. And the radio host rather aggressively asked him when he came and sat down, well, Mr. Campbell, you're talking and writing about myths all the time. Why are you doing that? Everybody knows that a myth is a lie. And Joseph Campbell said, how can I interact with this fellow? You know, how can I make myself understand to somebody with this kind of an attitude? And obviously that is a calumny, that is an insult to the subject. And what needs to be understood, and what the great mythologists of every age, but maybe particularly of the 20th century, where there was a modest but very important mythic revival centered around, well, I just mentioned one from America by Joseph Campbell, by Mircea Eliade, who, while Romanian, has lived here, University of Chicago, by my countryman Carl Kerényi, who was an acquaintance of my family, and a number of others who largely, owing to their interaction with C.G. Jung, had come to the conclusion that the myth is a matter of the story of the internal regions of consciousness. That by way of the myth we relate to the soul, or whatever you want to call it, psyche, and in also that we can understand often the myths if we have gained some understanding of the dynamics of the psyche and of the soul, because the two are very closely related. One might even say that the myth is the language of the soul. Now, having said that, just a tiny little glance at our talks here throughout the last couple of months, we have come, I think, to the conclusion that all myths originate in the soul. Some of them are maybe closer to that region of the soul which has been traditionally called the spirit, have a greater profundity, and they speak more directly to the truly profound and transcendental aspects of consciousness. But all of them are related to the psyche. Once again, my aforementioned countryman, Professor Carl Kerényi, had written once that there are some problems with some of our mythic heritage, especially of the ancient Greeks, because it is so old and has been sort of reworked and commented upon by Hoeller and by all kinds of people to such an extent that it's not that close to the source, but still very valuable. And then, to my abiding delight, he wrote that one of the places where you can find true mystical insight, right in the myth and right away, is in the myths of the Gnostics, because their myths have been written down, let's say, very soon after very profound experiences of Gnosis, and as such they bear that initial contact, that initial power with transcendence. Those are not his exact words, but that's what he said. And since pretty much all my life I have been devoted to the study and exposition, and not to say the experience of Gnosis, I felt that therefore us concerning ourselves with myth in a Gnostic sense was very important. And therefore, in our little series that we just completed, we started with the famous hymn of the Pearl, also known the hymn of the Robe of Glory, which is an early Gnostic hymn from apostolic times, and which is may be considered the monomyth of the Gnostic and Hermetic traditions. If one studies and understands that, one gets the whole picture, from the beginning of the coming into the world of the soul to its return to its original home. And then after that we reviewed to the best of our ability, owing to the very voluminous sources of the myth of Sophia, the divine feminine wisdom, and after that we moved on into the Middle Ages to the Grail myth and myth of Parsifal, and also the myth of the Green Knight. And with that we arrived historically to the post-Reformation era. From the Middle Ages we moved there, and then last Friday we reviewed and tried to interpret one of the Arthurian-related myths of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Now with that we have come through pretty much all of the history of Western culture, and we have arrived now in what was called, and should be called, the modern era, which really, at least when I went to school, was reckoned from the Reformation onward, Reformation and the Renaissance onward. And while looking at that particular historical period, we find let's say a contradictory movement of mythic terms. The last kind of really mysterious and profound monomyth having been the one that we discussed last week, actually, the Rosicrucian myth. So there also a sort of spiritual impulse, a mysterious kind of revelation came to certain people in Europe, starting in Germany, which had in its mythic content a fairly powerful keynote. And that keynote was that, well, we had a religious reformation with Luther and Calvin and all of those boys, and what we need now is a universal reformation. We need to reform the human soul and its attitude to life and its behavior, and both individual and collective activities and circumstances, which seems to, as we said, underlie the Rosicrucian mythos. I came across a few more ideas which we did not mention last time, and I am always torn in these kinds of discussions because I could, but would probably not be greatly appreciated if I did. I could make these very historical, because the histories of these myths and of the people who seem to propound them are present in history and are often very interesting. But on the other hand, we are not really here to look for history. We are here to look for meaning. We are here looking for a consciousness. But I think some of the little historical element that I neglected to mention last time was that for quite a long time, in a rather prominent fashion, particularly centered in Germany, but then also in France and elsewhere, the Rosicrucian mythos was there and continued. and some very prominent people in history, and probably to good effect, had considered themselves as being part of the Rosicrucian mythos and tried to utilize that within their field of activity. Some of these were monarchs of Europe at the time. Tsar Alexander I, the red-haired giant, as he was called in many places, because the Romanovs were generally, not all of them, even the martyred Tsar Nicholas II had red hair. But Tsar Alexander I and King Frederick William II of Prussia, who were contemporaries, considered themselves Rosicrucians. And there's a nice chronicle that came out of Potsdam, where the Prussian kings resided, that the Tsar has arrived this morning on horseback and went straight away to see the king, but as soon as the sun set, they both went to the underground Rosicrucian chapel and spent the night there, engaged in meditation and Rosicrucian rituals. And so there were all kinds of people of a mystical and occult orientation who were attached to the Rosicrucian mythos, and it was really an important one. And as I'll conclude this section now and then, and as we discussed in outline form last time, there is very plausible evidence that some of this mythos, some of this tradition that called itself Rosicrucian in the 18th century and into the 19th century had come to America. In fact, I'll mention in a few minutes one of the more popular ways that it came to America, and that in some way or the other it was influential upon the drafting of the Declaration of Independence of the United States, on the formation of the American Republic, and that it infused, let us say, this new, this novel and really very unusual country and state. Because, now you say, oh, well, the United States and this and, all kinds of countries in the world. But at the time of its formation, and for quite a period of time thereafter, the United States of America was an absolutely unique creation on the face of the earth. I challenge anybody to show me that more or less at the same time, when the United States declared its independence from the mother country, from England, and thereafter, that there was any other country that so openly voiced and implemented principles that are in our Constitution, that are in our Declaration of Independence, as the United States. It was very, very unique. And you know what? As far as I am concerned, and I'm foreign born, I came to this country as an adult, but I could see that, I can see that, and until my dying day, I will revere that spirit of the United States, because it is worth reverence, it is worth very serious attention, and it's worth absorbing and internalizing into ourselves. one of the most important features of this new country, which again was not present anywhere at that time, was the extensive religious freedom that was granted. No doubt there were practical reasons for it, because the population, the small population of the United States at that time consisted of several religions, and if you established one of them, as say like the established Church of England, the other ones would have been very unhappy and have caused trouble. But whatever the practical reasons may have been, the kind of total religious freedom has been an immense benefit of the United States, and became the, what could one say? It became the source, what in Latin we call the fons and origo, the fountain and origin of a great section of the American spirit. And that is very, very important, and I will show you soon. So let us say, if indeed, as some of the more esoteric evidence indicates, and I will refer several times to a man whose picture right now sits over there by the entrance, my late, what would I call him? My late teacher and boss, Manly Palmer Hall, who the anniversary of whose passing at the age of 89 we will commemorate this Sunday. He was died on, there he is, the 29th of October. So Mr. Manly Hall wrote some wrote a tremendous amount of wonderful stuff, but let us say he wrote a particular small work which was had a companion volume, which is entitled The Secret Destiny of America, which has been recently reissued and edited by a very fine contemporary occult historian, Mr. Mitch Horowitz, and which is sold at the Philosophical Research Society, maybe some other places too. And let's say, I think there is enough implicit and explicit evidence there indicating that yes, there were one or two mysterious persons who in all likelihood would have identified themselves as 18th century Rosicrucians, who came here and who facilitated and to some extent inspired the foundation of the United States, and that is undoubtedly of some considerable importance. Now, that's enough about the end of the chapter on the Rosicrucians, and now we go on from there. Well, as old Kronos, the mean god of time, because that's one of the few Greek gods who is a mean guy. I mean, he kills his own children. In all the artistic depiction, he looks like he wouldn't want to get into the way of this guy, real mean-looking face. And even the planet that is named after him, Saturn, is not a very happy planet. And people have been known to have a Saturnine disposition, that was an expression, when they are kind of grumpy and not very nice, and so certainly these Saturn, who is the god of time, has never been a very pleasant god, symbolically speaking, and consequently, a lot of human history is filled with sadness and misfortune and suffering and conflict and things of that sort, as far back as you can see. And we are justly, let's say, shocked and terrified when events occur in history like the ones that we now learn about Afghanistan and so forth. But you know, I lived long enough. If I make it another couple of months, I'll be 90 years old, you know, and I can tell you that while I am grieved by such things, I have seen like it, and I have seen worse, you know. Just in one year and one season, let's see, which one would that have been? Would have been the summer of 1943. 100,000 of my countrymen, young Hungarian men, were slaughtered in the Ukraine in the war against Russia. 100,000 in a couple of months' time. You know, that's quite a bit. And so every historical period we look at is frightening. But of course, on the other hand, if we also have not only a left eye with which we see the frightening things, but if we maintain a right eye with which we see other things, then we see, oh yeah, but at the same time or very close to that, various good things have happened. Because the two are always there. This is a dual world. And the recognition of that and our ability to act on that, I think, is extremely important. Now then, so we come now to the so-called modern era. Just as turbulent, even more so, turbulent and bloody and confused and unhappy in much of it as the present era, if not more so. I mean, such things as in the wake of the Reformation, the 30 Years' War. You know? First of all, to fight a war for 30 years is in itself a heck of a condition. You know? But in addition to that, devastations and famines. People were literally becoming cannibalistic in Germany, which was a pretty advanced country even then. Why? Because in the course of the warfare, their sources of nourishment had been devastated. There were no crops, there were no animals, there was no wheat, you couldn't make bread, and on in that fashion. So that was sort of the beginning of that period. So now also, let's say, the shake-up of the religious situation in Christendom as the result of the Reformation was big, was monumental. And see, Europe did not do what the United States did. As I mentioned, that's one of the reasons for the United States of being so unique. Europe did not counter the then arising and often very turbulent religious pluralism with tolerance, as the United States said. Okay, you want to be a Lutheran, be my guest. You want to be a Calvinist, you want to be a Catholic, you want to be an Anabaptist. Oh no, they were all at each other's throats. So the turbulence and the warfare and the poverty, continued. Then there came sort of 18th century, right around the time when America, the United States was formed. Then there came movements, little movements, ideas. Some of them were very having a mystical inspiration, which tried to counteract this terrible religious intolerance and warfare. And ultimately they sort of congealed in what has been called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, which was led by philosophers initially primarily French, people like Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, D'Alembert, people like that, who essentially tried to counteract the religious fanaticism with all of its terrible shadow by substituting something else for it. What they seemingly substituted for it, or wanted to substitute for it at a popular level, was reason. Raison. But you know, at the same time, I think the history of the Enlightenment and of some of the great figures of the Enlightenment era is the best proof that you can't really make it on a one side by turning your consciousness in a one-sided fashion. Voltaire, the great rationalist, you know, he was an ardent Freemason. Isaac Newton, scientist, rationalist, when he died, they found a curious wing of his house where nobody knew what that was all about. It was a laboratory of alchemy. Isaac Newton was a practicing alchemist till the end of his days. They don't tell you these things. They tell you, I'll tell you these things because I was interested in them always. All kinds of things of that sort. So let us say, this of course is purely a personal opinion of mine, namely that the Enlightenment philosophers, French, English, German primarily, had a plan to somehow get away from religious fanaticism. But that doesn't mean that they were really, in their own hearts and in their minds, anti-religious or irreligious. What they were against was the fanatical practice and implementation of a religion, but not the foundations of a religion. And that is why clear down into the 19th century, the philosopher of reason of Germany, Immanuel Kant, a real character. Somebody should make a movie out of Immanuel Kant's life. He was so attached to punctuality that he lived and taught at the university in Königsberg, which was a very important center in Prussia at that time. So that every day he walked from his house to the university, from the university back to his own house. And he was so precise in the time of his walk that the housewives of Königsberg looked out the window and set their watches by whether Professor Kant has gone already or whether he was going. Very, very precise. Yet at the same time, let's say, he, as most of these people, recognize that there must be, and this is very important for us to recognize because this is as true today as it was then, that there must be the recognition on our part of an underlying spiritual foundation. That reason is real good for a lot of things. And one often wishes that more people were, as we call it, reasonable than they are. It's very much so. But at the same time, reason will not suffice. It is important, and it can replace other mistaken notions. But underneath it all, there must be a spiritual foundation. And that spiritual foundation then, to a major extent, also supplies us with the German word for is Maxime, with foundations, with doctrines, with principles of behavior. You see, it's not what people say, oh, well, you know, what do I care whether Jehovah ever gave Moses a bunch of stone tablets? You know, we used to say in the 60s that God gave Moses a number of tablets and all the children of Israel got stoned. Tablets, you know, tablets. So I shouldn't have said that, but what the heck. One has to have fun sometimes. In any event, you know, the mythos behind it, which had the mythology, which was a mythology in most instances, but then has been unfortunately turned into dogma. You know, that mythology matters less than the substance of the teaching and the practice that arises therefrom. And that is one of the reasons I brought up Immanuel Kant, because Kant, you know, they always say, oh, you know, the great rationalist. Kant had, one of his sayings was, der gestirnte Himmel über mir und das moralische Gesetz in mir soll mir Richtung werden. I am sure that all of you understood this completely. Anyway, it says that the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me, these are the ones that shall give me direction. Is that a rationalist? Heavens no. Heavens no. These things are important. All of these people were conscious to some degree or extent of their spiritual roots. But it was a great ongoing period of turmoil, and so they tried to get away from the religious fanaticism. You also need to remember there were two terrible historical events. One in the 1300s, and in any way they were in the late, one somewhat earlier. And they both affected particularly France. And a certain stratum of people, intellectuals, people who wrote and read books and so on and so forth, had never forgotten them, and they were number one. The Albigensian Crusade, or the Crusade against the Cathars, were one of the loveliest segments of the population in what is now the south of France was exterminated on religious grounds. And the other one, a little bit later, we don't need to worry too much about the exact chronology, was the extermination of the Order of the Templars, of Jacques Molay and Guy de Auvergne and all the rest of them, who were basically martyred on the basis of lies also. Now, the French soul had not forgotten that, neither of them. And from then on, there was a substantial segment of the French people who said, this religious fanaticism has got to stop. We have to defeat the Catholic Church somehow, because it has perpetuated these kinds of things. Just sociologically speaking, which probably doesn't interest you that much, because these two terrible exterminations, I mean, I think the Albigensian Crusade can justly be called a Holocaust. That's what it was, you know. And obviously there were fewer Templars, that wasn't of that large a number, but still, the common people, the French citizen, remained horrified, remained scandalized by the Albigensian Crusade. How could the Church and various people cooperating with the Church do something of this sort? Also, people were burned by the hundreds, by the thousands. And the French aristocracy, the French nobility, was better to say in turn, had almost every noble family had one or two young men or men who were Templars, had them in the Templar order. And when the Templar order was dissolved and so many of the Templars got killed, the French nobility said, look what the king and the Pope had done to us. They had killed off our sons. They have hurt our lineage. And from then on, there was a very uneasy relationship between the French nobility and the Church. And sometimes the French nobility and the king. And this is a story, after all, which appeared in many books. And it was this, that on the day, on the day of which was a terrible crime itself, on the day of the execution of King Louis XVI and of Marie Antoinette, there were not only mean Parisian ladies knitting there, you know, les tricoteuses, the old story, but there were all kinds of people. And that an old man with a great big beard got up. When the king and the queen were led to the guillotine, and he exclaimed in sonorous French, "This is the revenge of Jacques de Molay." And with that he got up and he left. Jacques de Molay having been the Grand Master of the Templar Order, who was executed sometime before. But you know, people have a good memory. Now, whether that occurred or not, but these were some of the forces that were present. But now, there is something that is very important for us to know, and not only to know, but to remember from time to time, that developments can take place in human history, in human society, which appear to be needed, maybe, and useful, and which therefore may be, if not exactly endorsed enthusiastically, but at least tolerated. Yeah. Such a development was what Nostradamus the prophet, who was a Frenchman too, his name was de Notre Dame. Anyway, but Nostradamus had predicted and called the vulgar advent. And now you know. In other words, when the masses come at Advent, you know, when the proletariat, as the Marxists came to call it later on, try to take over and do take over. All right? When that time came, that was called the French Revolution. And it started with some pretty good ideas, you know. Some of the people there, Lafayette, who after all became a hero here in America too, and who, by the way, was a nobleman, a Marquis de Lafayette, and even many others, Montesquieu, various people who were involved in sort of preparing the big change, the French Revolution. You know where most of them ended up? On the guillotine themselves. In fact, there is an unsubstantiated story, but after all, myths are unsubstantiated stories, aren't they? Very likely true that, you know, the guillotine has a feminine ending. They often what was called the Red Lady, because she was full of blood, was named the guillotine because of a medical doctor by the name of Dr. Guillotin, who invented it. And I rather believe he came to the conclusion he shouldn't have invented it. You know why? Because he himself perished under the guillotine. So, you know, things got out of hand. The philosophers couldn't say, no, mesdames, mes amis, we have to stay rational. This has to be the rule of reason. The reason off went the organ of reason, you know, and it was terrible. Now, my great-great-grandfather was there as an Austrian traveler and businessman in Paris. And he couldn't get out because the reign of terror was reigning. You know what? He was traumatized by that till the end of his days. And I saw letters of his written, and so in which he said that I was walking in human blood up to my ankles every day during the reign of terror. Finally, though, smart fellow, some of our family were smart, you know, he got out of Paris, and then he said, I want to live somewhere which is as far away from France as possible. And you know where he settled? In Hungary! In any event, you know, it was really something terrible. And it traumatized much of Europe. Meanwhile, the spiritual little flickers were also there, because the French intellectuals and so forth said to themselves, well, look, the church is eclipsed and the power of the church is being taken away. The king has eclipsed, and in that particular case had died. And then before we have to have something to rely on. And there were particularly two people. One, a French nobleman by the name of Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, who was a military officer in the king's army and was stationed somewhere in the south of France. And he in turn befriended a gentleman of Spanish or Portuguese family, Senor Martinez de Pasquale. And these two, Martinez de Pasquale and Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, had founded what is still around secretly, sometimes associated with Freemasonry, which is called the Martinist movement, or the Martinist order. De Pasquale, by the way, he was the big theoretician, really. He worked out a whole, a sort of alternative version of the Bible. And his myth, because all of these things have to have a myth, his myth was to the effect that after the creation of the human race and paradise and all that sort of thing, some big catastrophe happened, a spiritual catastrophe. And this catastrophe had broken up the psychic structure of humanity, so that human beings are no longer whole. I think I know somebody named Carl Jung who said that quite a bit later on. They are not whole because some kind of a cosmic catastrophe had broken their souls apart. And therefore, what a good mystic, a good occultist, a good magician, by that time often called that way, has to do is to find ways of putting these broken pieces together. And I think that Martinez de Pasquale even said that it's not only the human, which is very Gnostic, it's really the whole world that is a broken vessel. It's just broken up. And so we have to become affinitized to the spiritual worlds, and particularly he was very fond of angels. After all, angels are nice beings. If you want to be fond of somebody, might as well be fond of an angel. You know? In any event, that with the help of certain classes of angels, the unity of the broken world can be reestablished, so it wouldn't be a broken world anymore. And his disciple, Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, in fact, he somewhat got away because Martinez designed, and now the magical tradition comes in, he designed a form of angel magic. And these were magical practices invoking the angels which would help us to unite ourselves and to unite the world. In fact, it's still called in some of the circles Martinezism. You know where Martinez de Pasquale then eventually toward the end of his life, where he went and where he died? In a place that is often in the news and in sad ways, to Haiti, or you often call it Haiti, but it doesn't have to do with hating anything, but to Haiti. And I think he himself was of mixed racial lineage. And then Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin remained in France and wrote the most fabulously beautiful meditative poetry to address the divine in order to remove the brokenness of human nature. They are still available, very lyrically, really beautiful stuff. And then came the French Revolution. And the Jacobins, the Reds from Paris, were on their way to the south of France to capture Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin and to bring him back and cut off his head. But what? He cheated them. He lied down and was praying and praying and praying. While praying, his soul left his body. By the time his enemies arrived, they only found a dead body. And this is the origin of the Martinist tradition. Well, there were all sorts of things, with the reduction of the power of the Catholic Church, with the constant political upheavals as they were in France. First you had a king, then you had a republic, then you had a king again, then you had a king of a different dynasty, then you had, first of that you had Napoleon, who was actually a dictator calling himself an emperor, and then two more kings down the line, and then another, the nephew of Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon. And when that was all over, then the Republic again, which has sort of been, weaseling along ever since. So let's say, it wasn't a very peaceful situation. And at certain times, like in the early 19th century, but now we are jumping a little bit too much ahead, in the 1840s, around there, then there were other big upheavals everywhere. It was often referred to as the springtime of nation, because it was the beginning of nationalism. If everybody, Frenchman, German, Italian, everybody, the nation. But when you exalt your own nation so frightfully and consistently, what is likely to happen is that your nation and somebody else's nation are going to collide. And this was the beginning now of the national wars, right down to World War I and World War II. So there were all kinds of problems. But meanwhile, the spiritual longing of those people who were ready for this sort of thing grew bigger and bigger. And the Rosicrucian tradition in some ways was still there. Freemasonry was very occult and very alchemical at that time. I'm a brother of Hiram, but that doesn't mean that I know anything. But let's put it this way. I was presented some years ago with copies of a very old and very important Masonic journal, English Masonic journal. And the reason I was presented with it, because in it were, it must be at least 60, 70 pages, small print, was the history of, in a certain historical period, of Freemasonry in Hungary. Well, I said, okay, well, this will be probably. I even became more interested when I started reading it, because practically on every page I found names who are relatives of mine. My mother's family and her innumerable relatives, so my father's family came from Austria, but all of that. And the clincher was that they read, over there has been a new Masonic lodge has been established in the town of, I don't know, Satmar or somewhere. And it consists of a large house, and then adjoining to it a smaller house, which is the alchemical laboratory. And all down the line, a vast number of the Masonic lodges who were built at that time, or some of them that were dissolved, all had an alchemical laboratory attached to their work. You tell it to a lot of contemporary Freemasons, they'll think that you're crazy. But you may or may not be crazy in addition, but it was a very, very important psycho-spiritual discipline. And people who were interested in these things practiced it. And then something else came out of the out of the hinterlands, and that was magic. And it came primarily by way of literary activities, and the literary activities of one Frenchman who died in 1875. So he must have, and he was a fairly advanced age by then, so he was there for quite a long time, and whose nom de plume was Eliphas Levi Zahed. His French name was Alphonse Louis Constant, and he changed that to Hebrew Eliphas Levi Zahed, and who wrote a number of fascinating books, probably the chief of which was La Magie Haute, the high magic, and has different translations in English. But let us see, he called attention to the utility and viability of ceremonial magic, especially in connection with the Kabbalah. He is particularly precious to me because he is the first one that I know of who connected the Kabbalah with the tarot cards. And he managed to place the major arcana on the 22 paths of the Kabbalistic tree of life and others, and he really started something, let's say. He aroused the interest of a number of really eager people who wanted practical spirituality. And this is also an important thing to remember, especially in view of another subject that I'm going to jump to now within the same overall subject, that the human psyche is so constituted that when it becomes really interested in something, it has a strong urge to do something about it. But at some historical periods, well, certainly in the Renaissance, which was the time when ceremonial magic was really practiced in a big way and so forth, there was a lot. But people become very heady, very intellectual, and they love to spend their time thinking about things, but not doing anything, right? At least they could have learned that much from the Catholic Church, because whatever its faults may have been, and certainly, both Catholic and Protestant churches fell very short of their ideals in the course of their history. But let's say the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church is largely lost. The Catholic Church, no matter what its faults may have been, always had the sacraments. It always had baptism, it always had confirmation, and primarily it had the Eucharist with the bread and the wine. And it is my opinion, and as Mr. Manly Hall used to like to say, is you're entitled to your opinion, that to a very large extent that's what kept the Church, the Catholic Church, the Western Church going. That and one other mysterious figure, the figure of the Virgin Mary. If it hadn't been for the Virgin Mary, I think there would not be a Christian religion any longer. But again, that's my opinion. So this is the evening for voicing a lot of opinions. But let us say, people began to realize, especially the generally pretty practical Frenchmen like Eliphas Levi, that if you want to get into, so to say, you use that term, get into spiritual things, it has to be active. You have to be able to do something. You can't just read books and think. Because as one teacher of mine, Professor Ernest Wood, I can just envision him on the stage there where he used to speak. Wonderful, wonderful man. Lived in India, taught school in India for 20-some years and all of that. And one of the things I remember from Ernest, where he said, you have to remember that thinking only leads to more thinking. So that's not that you should stop thinking, but remember that you can get only so far with that. And that is why I say the magical revival, which was sparked by Eliphas Levi, but of course others thereafter, was that sort of thing, the mystical to the occult in practice. Now, what's the underlying... now I'm putting myself out on the limb again, but what can you do? Like Rockabye Baby, I might fall off the treetop. What was, let's say, in Eliphas Levi's works, and they're not easy reading, Transcendental Magic, as it has been translated, is probably the most worthwhile of his books. Anyway, what were they really up to? What is the objective? So you draw a circle and the pentacles, and you hold up the wand, and you have candles standing around, and you chant the Hebrew words and various things like that. What's the objective? Well, the objective is always at the end of a process. It isn't at the beginning. And the objective is that you have to learn how to deal with non-physical and even non-intellectual reality. You have to be able to pull yourself away from the physical, from the dominance of the physical, let us say, and to some extent also the tyranny of the mind, the tyranny of thinking, the tyranny of the intellect. And when you do that, and there, after all, people have been doing this since the days of the shamans. The scholars, people like Mircea Eliade and others tell you that the ceremonial magic, for instance, is a direct descendant in a sophisticated setting of shamanism. It's the magic, folks. But so you begin to interact with the ordinarily invisible and intangible worlds. You begin to converse with the spirits, with angels. If you are not disinclined from that sort of thing, and I certainly am, and that certainly wouldn't, you may be conversing with demons. Which is not a practical thing, because those guys are very cunning, and they almost inevitably get the best of the magician. They are too smart. But that's why demons are best left out of the picture. But all sorts of ordinarily invisible beings. And why? Just because you want to talk to a spook, or maybe even no. It is because those things, even as divinations like the tarot and so forth, Eliphas Levi said that already, these are preliminary exercises to sharpen the powers of your psyche so that you will be able then to do greater and better things, or bigger things. Now, what is the bigger thing? Well, Eliphas Levi said it already, but a lot of people didn't pay too much attention to it. And he said that there is an angel, there is an angelic being, in ceremonial magic often referred to as the Holy Guardian Angel, the HGA. And that's the reason they called it the Guardian Angel, is because it's similar to the Catholic doctrine that of a guardian angel being attributed to each human who takes care of their spiritual welfare. This is a little different. But again, it is an angelic presence which is specifically yours. It looks out for you. If you address it, it will help you. And this is what in ceremonial magic is called the HGA, the Holy Guardian Angel. And so really all of ceremonial, the magical evocations, which are the lower ones, the invocations, which are more angelic, these are all modes of training in order to ultimately confront one very important and very powerful and very marvelous being, referred to in that literature as a Holy Guardian Angel. So there we stand now at into 70s, we have come out of the turbulent 1700s with the French Revolution and all of these things, and entered the 19th century. So what we find in Europe and in America, what we find are small or not so small groups of people who are striving for spiritual things. And quite a few of those had come over to America from Europe. And curiously enough, although it's a nice part of the country, a heck of a lot of them settled in the Hudson Valley of upper state New York. Now, if you've ever been there, and if you go there, just sort of sniff you with your psychic smell a little bit, it is an unusual country. It is a magical country. That doesn't mean I would want to live there. It's too doggone much snow. But that's where a lot of them settled, beginning with the Shakers and Quakers and all sorts of mostly kind of miracle-oriented spiritual groups, but quite a bit of magic among them. Manly Hall said that there was a definite German, very popular, sort of almost like German country people, German peasants, who were all Rosicrucians of their own kind, who came to the Hudson Valley. And there is a town there called Pfalz, which is exactly like the German Pfalz, P-F-A-L-S. And these were the places where these weird Germans settled very early, even before the American Revolution, because you could come to America if you managed to catch a boat, and so forth. And all of these things were, and they were they were a sort of brewing and bubbling of spiritual and quasi-spiritual forces in the United States, separate from the big churches, the Anglican Church and the Methodist Church and the Quakers and the Presbyterians, and so, well, the Quakers belong. In any event, there was a religious ferment of unconventional spirituality in the USA, which became very, very important as history went on. But there were, in a different way, the same kind of thing was also going on in Europe. And so we came to the middle and then to the latter part of the 19th century, which heralded an incredible 25 years or more, quarter of a year or more, of spiritual, well, how should I call it, of spiritual revivals of a certain kind all over the world. And in that period, interestingly enough, in the United States, in this case, not in the Hudson Valley, but in the city of New York. See, you can have spiritual things in the midst of a big city if you attend to it. Otherwise, you just have balderdash and epidemics, you know. But in any event, a movement started at that time, beginning in New York City, which became extremely influential the world over, in spite of its relatively small membership at any given time. And what was that? Well, you are sitting in a building that belongs to it, the Theosophical Society, founded in New York City on November 17th, 1875, and from there spread all over the world. Its principal teacher, and when we are done, can show you her pictures, right back there, was a Russian-born lady from a noble Russian family, and who went by the name of Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Blavatsky had been her married name. She was married for a relatively short time to a Russian government official. She was probably about 18 years old, and he was 80 or close to it. No, at least 60, or at least in his 60s or in his 70s. A very big age difference. So they didn't get along, and she started traveling throughout the world and started having inspirations. You know, at that time, the big popular sort of the vulgar, the common people's occultism was spiritualism, and there were a heck of a lot of spiritualists in America and in other places, also in Europe. Well, the Civil War helped something, because the Civil War produced such an immense number of casualties. You know, I think it was the bloodiest engagement that the United States had ever engaged in. It was, you know, against its own people. So then 1848, which was really before the Civil War, but then were the first stirrings of spiritualism. And two young women, Katie and Maggie Smith, in New York State, in Hydesville, New York. I really don't know what part of New York State it is located. They started conversing with spirits, with the spirits of the dead. And that particular activity grew like wildfire, and for a long time, certainly until the end of the 19th century, into the 20th century, was a very popular activity. But within the spiritualists, or the people who were interested in studying spiritualism, there were also people to whom that was not enough. And I said, well, when Grandpa was alive, he didn't know a doggone thing about real estate. He was a farmer. And now they invoke him in the seance and ask him advice about how to buy and sell real estate. So, these people assume that because somebody died, that now his spirit has become all-knowing and all-powerful. And Madame Blavatsky for one said, well, the likelihood is that there was a stupid person who died. He is still stupid where he is now. Maybe he'll wise up in due course. But in other words, nevertheless, there was a lot of interest. There was a lot of occult activity and interest and so forth. Now, Madame Blavatsky, and I could talk about her forever because I really like her, and if one things even out again a little bit with all these epidemics and nonsense that's going on now, we're going to resume my class on the esoteric teachings of Madame Blavatsky because I really like her. But what was Madame Blavatsky trying to do? Madame Blavatsky, number one, said, we have to have an open and active bunch of people. We have to have an open society. Not like Freemasonry where you have to swear an oath, not other magical groups and so which are all secret, but one that can be open to the public. And we're going to teach certain doctrines, and maybe people will then do their own thing. So it was the first open and free occult organization, maybe since the time of the Alexandrian period in the 3rd century, because there was neither a church nor a state nor anything looking over it. So this really drew the people. People were really interested in this. And then Madame Blavatsky and her coterie moved to India and established the Theosophical Society in India, then later on back in England, Europe, all of that. And so there were now branches of the Theosophical Society all over the world, and they created a tremendous amount of interest in in the occult, in the spiritual, in the magical, whatever you want to call it. And this was of immense importance and of immense benefit. Now, I never identify myself as a theosophist because theosophy is not my religion. My religion is Gnostic Christianity, but on the other hand, I have a great deal of respect for the early theosophical teachers like Blavatsky and others, and I feel that it's a very, very fine and very noble cause, and therefore I have traveled and lectured in behalf of the Theosophical Society on several continents. I have a great deal of respect for the Theosophical Society and Theosophy. But like always, things are never perfect. If you find anything or anybody or any teaching that's really perfect, please tell me. Because I surely would like to encounter one. I haven't yet. And let's say the theosophical teachings, Madame Blavatsky's, the majority of Madame Blavatsky's writings and others, and there were some, really talented, wonderful people who were drawn to this. Clear into, of course, by then they were on their way out of this world, but clear into the 20th century, clear into the middle of the 20th century, when I joined the Theosophical Society in 1952. I will be forever grateful for some of the people whom I met and interacted with in this very room and other places of the Theosophical Society. But let's say things are not being perfect. Some things snuck in, which I think maybe weren't all that helpful. That's somewhat inevitable. One of it was a very rigid and sort of downright dogmatic attitude to what were considered more than two, cardinal teachings which explain everything: reincarnation, karma, and the existence of spiritual masters, master teachers. In my humble opinion, and my Theosophist friends know my opinion in that regard, I think all three of those teachings were overdone. And like always, when a true teaching is emphasized excessively, it begins to lose its truth. The thing that we have to learn, if we can, in this field is to walk lightly. Walk lightly on the terrain of the occult. Don't get too heavy about it. Don't get too dogmatic about it. Don't turn the occult and theosophy into a an occult counterpart of fundamentalist Christianity. And this has been done because people have that kind of an attitude. And yet, particularly in the last few years, it is becoming increasingly clear on the basis of the discovery of various writings, documents, the esoteric writings of Madame Blavatsky, for instance, that she considered most of her teachings as being, how should we put it, a sort of lightweight material for those who are not ready for anything deeper. And that she was not in love with reincarnation or karma, although these were teachings that just came in from India at that time, and they appealed to people because what the heck to make some karma, as people call it. Always when you make karma, it's maybe you're sort of making bread or something, making karma. But let's say it certainly beats going to hell, right? So that all of these things were an improvement on existing spiritual teachings. But at the same time, let's say, I always felt from the beginning, even though I was a very devoted theosophist, that some things here need to be looked at, maybe in greater depth. And as time went on, I was able to do it, and I was able to find sources, and including more recently with the publication of the esoteric writings of Madame Blavatsky, which came out only a few years ago, it is quite evident that she considered pretty much all of her teachings, including karma, reincarnation, and so forth, and her vast literary output in something like the Secret Doctrine, she considered this sort of preliminary and introductory literature to something deeper. Now, if the secret doctrine is a lightweight literature, well, then my concept of lightweight literature is different. But still, she said, this was, so to say, for the general public to. And apparently she felt that by her writings, such as Isis Unveiled, which was the first big one, and then Secret Doctrine, and all of these, that they were a good stimulus. They were a good introductory material to people until they get ready for something deeper. Now, of course, people wanted, and many people even now, they want very definite, concrete things. They want to know that they're going to come back reincarnated, and they want to know how much time they're going to spend in the other worlds before they reincarnate. They want to know exactly how karma works. And when the spiritual teachers, who came to be known as masters, they want to know how tall they are, how long a beard they have, and all kinds of piffle of this sort, as if that were important. But already in her first book, which incidentally was set into print and printed for the first edition here in Los Angeles by two brothers by the name of James Morgan Price and John Price, P-R-Y-S-E, who were disciples of her, and one of them was a very fine writer, and that was James, and John Price was a printer. Now, that was her very first publication, Isis Unveiled. That's a poetic title for the mystery, In Isis, there is a key sentence which was brought to my attention by another teacher of mine, and it runs like this: whatever you do, never lose sight of your own divine and immortal soul. But there are thousands of words in that book, so it was easy to pass that one by, but some people recognize it. But now, with the publication of her esoteric writings, which were written for the instruction of a small private group of her students, her esoteric school in London. By then I think she was living in Annie Besant's house in London. In any event, you see there that is exactly what she's talking about. What she is writing about is that the objective of life is to discover your own divine and immortal soul, your higher self, as she often calls it. And when you discover that, then you will be in the truth, and you will be guided, and everything will be all right. And that everything short of that is woefully short. And so all the intellectual teachings and all the attachment to karma and things of that sort are of limited value. And she even uses the diagrammatic representation. Oh my goodness! And to finish, she speaks of that. It is very, very similar to the objectives that were declared by Eliphas Levi and the other magicians. They said, first, the vision of your holy guardian angel. First, you have to be able to visualize him. Number two, there is the vision, the conversation with the holy guardian angel. And eventually, there is the union with the holy guardian angel. So when you read her esoteric writings, and when you read between the lines of what she was teaching, underneath it all, and often camouflaged in various ways, there is the teaching, look, you are the embodiment of the ultimate divinity, as in the stanzas of John, which are an occult poem, upon which she used as sort of the foundation of her secret doctrine. We are the sparks who have come from the flame. And there are sentences from that because we are at the end of our time, in the secret doctrine, for instance, says, said the flame to the spark, thou art myself. I have clothed myself in thee. Flame is the ultimate divine. The spark is inside of us, and the eternal, the great mystery from whence everything came is in miniature and maybe undeveloped in us. So we have to first have the vision of this. We have to interact. We have to become close. And then eventually we become conscious of the union. These are the objectives. Now that doesn't mean that we can do it right now, or everybody can do it right now, or even a few people can do it right now. But it is the process. And I think that by bringing that first in sort of a camouflaged manner and openly, without restrictions, without having to swear oaths, without swearing on theosophical Bibles and things like that. With that, I think she and her followers did a very, very great and very marvelous job. Now, how to... so what is all this? What is the secret doctrine? You know, particularly because the secret doctrine has, I'm not going to go into details, it's available, and it's really, it's both difficult and enjoyable reading, if that is possible, you know. But what is it really all about? And a very prominent theosophist and a very wise woman whom I knew, a lady now gone by the name of Joy Mills, said right out in public, the secret doctrine is a myth. It is the story out of which you can extract the real. You see. So don't just believe in the story, but look behind. Similarly, I was never terribly fond, and there I differed with some important people, of the kind of very concrete teaching of the masters. And this was then made more concrete by some theosophical teachers. I have a great respect for C.W. Leadbeater, but I think he was one. And then others who came sort of out of the theosophical fold, like Alice Bailey and so forth, masters and initiations and upon initiations and so forth. And what is it again? It's really, as somebody told me once, the master is inside of you. If he is not there, he is nowhere. He is not in the Himalayas, he is not in the Gobi Desert, he is not in Shambhala. If he is not inside of you, forget it. you know. This is extremely important. We have to draw together. All right, now. But my anxiety about ourselves, about the state of our culture, about where we as a culture may be coming is great. I think of H.P. Blavatsky and her mission and says, Helena Petrovna, were things this bad when you were here? You know? Did people even listen to you? And the answer comes, it was different, but yes, they did. And so I think that with all the so-called secular societies, with all the Marxist myth, which has created the Gulag Archipelago, the millions of butchered people in China, the killing fields of Cambodia and all of that, and the other realm of stupidity, the so-called National Socialism of Hitler, you know, these are mind-made pseudo-myths. They don't come from anywhere but from people's heads. And therefore, they are never going to go anywhere. If something does not come from the spirit, it isn't going anywhere. And if you keep company with that which is not of the spirit, then you are not going anywhere. So if you want to go step by step to that which all the great myths have talked and written about, if you want to get closer and closer to the center, if you want to come closer to the holy guardian angel, to your true self, then keep that in mind and be wise, be compassionate, be considerate of the immense spiritual needs of humanity which are not being met and which are not even considered at the present time. You keep all of these things in mind and keep going, and before long the true self, the holy guardian angel, the great one, will come toward you, and you will, as a scene about Jesus in the Pistis Sophia, when his other self appears, they rose up, they embraced, and they became one. May that day come close, may it come soon, may the opposition vanish like the mist before the sun, and may indeed the great myth, the myth of truth, the myth of the divinity of all and of ourselves, and of the divine help and inspiration that is available to us, may they come soon, and may our little efforts here have been and maybe will be conducive to that, because that is what we are trying to facilitate. And my God, may it come soon. Thank you very much.